Okay, so as usual, before we get started, does anybody have any questions about anything? We're good? We're good. Okay, so we're going to be reading Sir Orfeo for next time. It's in the little paperback of Sir Gawain and the Green Knights, and those are the page numbers. Okay, so then, how did this go for you? What did you guys think?
Odin's nosy.
Yeah. Odin is always kind of poking around and seems to be inconsistent in his affections, right? One day he's helping a particular family, and then years on down the road he is engineering their downfall, right? So, do you notice anything particular about the description of Odin that might be interesting for our purposes here?
They keep calling him the Gray One. One-eyed man.
Yeah.
He wears a hat that slips over his eye.
Yeah, he's usually depicted here as an old man with a wide-brimmed hat, right?
He looks like a beggar.
Always trying to look inconspicuous.
As inconspicuous as an old blind man with a wide-brimmed hat can,
I don't know
right?
how inconspicuous it is when you walk into the middle of a wedding feast and stab a sword into a tree trunk. That's
Yes. Yeah, that's pretty brassy, right?
Yeah.
So there's nothing particularly culturally symbolic, to worry about here in terms of this. The reason I want you to pay attention to the way Odin is described is, again, for the purposes of the course, Odin's general description and some of his habits match very closely those of Gandalf. So, Odin in the sagas is not the only source Tolkien uses for the creation of this particular character, but he's one of the big ones. Though, of course, Gandalf's purposes are a little bit more generally benign or benevolent than Odin's are, right? Anything else that really struck you about this saga?
It's more dramatic than the Skywalker family, that's for sure.
Okay. Yeah.
I've got to kill you to avenge my father, but then, I got to kill you to avenge my father. And then you've got brother and sister love. It's Game of Thrones.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually a pretty good analogy for this, right? Yeah, that this is a very similar kind of complicated family drama, right? In addition to being a fantasy story with dragons and gods and wizards and shit, right? And this is all kind of part and parcel of the whole Icelandic saga package, right? So let me talk a little bit about what this is exactly, and then we'll get back to kind of digging into the content a little bit. So the Icelandic sagas are produced primarily in the 13th and 14th centuries in Iceland, yes, very good. And they typically draw on older material to weave into a kind of whole narrative, right? So the sagas are all in prose. However, they're often based on much older poetic material. And the basic treatment of incident in a saga is, even when we're dealing with the legendary material, more or less realist. It's kind of like, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, as you probably noted here, right? Even like what we would regard as fantastic incidents are often treated very matter-of-factly. So the word saga in Old Norse means simply something said. And there's a variety of different types. The most common types are what are called Islendinga saga, or Sogor being the plural of saga. And this simply means Icelander's saga. So these are stories about the families that settled Iceland and their various relationships, feuds, conflicts, often with a good deal of discussion of land ownership and dispute and legal proceedings. One of the interesting things about Iceland, well, medieval Iceland as a culture, is how both violent and extremely litigious people are. They developed a very kind of advanced legal culture. In fact, I'm not sure if you guys are aware of this, but the Norse, I believe, actually invented the concept of trial by jury. Another popular kind of saga are what are called Fornaldarsögur, or legendary sagas. And Fornaldarsögur deal not just with mythic material, but also with tales of the Norse before the settlement of Iceland, right? So pretty much anything that takes place before the settlement of Iceland falls under the Fornaldarsögur category. So the Saga of the Volsungs is one of these. Right, we're talking about events primarily in Denmark, Sweden, and what is now northern France. Nothing to do with Iceland proper, and there are dragons and dwarves and gods running around, right? Plus shape-shifting magicians. And magic swords. And wish maidens. And Valkyries.
A magical skin.
And yeah, magical wolf skins, right? Yeah. So there are all kinds of mythic elements in this, right? But it is also a family saga, like these Icelander sagas, right? By and large, at least up to the point that you read, this is the tale of the Volsung family, right? From before the birth of its eponymous progenitor to the deaths of his last male descendants. So, the second half, which you didn't read, is mostly concerned with the resolution of feuds that occur after Sigurd's death, and that involve people who are identifiable as real historical figures. So, for example, Gunnar, the king of the Burgundians, is identifiable in Latin sources as a king by the name of Bindaharius. Right. Atli, who is here, Brynhild's brother, and is the king of the Huns, is, of course, the great Hunnish leader and general Attila. These two, I don't think, were actually contemporaries. But one thing to note about the sagas generally is that they don't seem to treat different groups as being ethnically different in any way, right? Basically, everybody is treated as though they're members of more or less the same culture, and they're simply rival tribes, right, or rival family groups. But this part isn't particularly important for what we're talking about today. Right, so what we're talking about today is the first half that involves all the magic swords and dragons and stuff, right? All right, so where do you guys want to start with this? Was there anything that you found particularly confusing or interesting in all of this?
The names are always going to trump me.
Yeah, and there are so many characters, right? A lot of the names are kind of similar, and it is often hard to remember exactly who is who. And it doesn't help when, you have a character, accomplish something, right? And then it simply says, like it does about King Helgi on page 50, and he is out of the saga. Right? That happens fairly frequently in sagas, right? Once a character is no longer important to the main storyline and isn't going to appear again, and he is out of the saga, is a formula that is typically used to suggest, okay, we're not talking about him anymore. So yeah, the names are a little bit difficult, right? So let's at least kind of tease out exactly who the most important people are here, right? And how they're connected to each other. So we start, more or less, with King Volsung. And what's weird about Volsung's birth?
He was fully born, like full grown.
Yeah, his mother's pregnant with him for 6 years, right? And he's born more or less fully grown. His conception is also unusual, right? His father eats an apple that's given to him by a wish maiden in order to increase his fertility, and then manages to beget Volsung upon Volsung's mother, right? And then this same wish maiden, Hjöd, who brought the apple, returns and marries Volsung, right? So even in the formation of the line, there is something like almost kind of weirdly incestuous, right? This is a detail that's kind of in there from the beginning. And then,
Is she a giant?
what's that?
Isn't she the daughter of a giant?
She's the daughter of a giant. Now, in Scandinavian mythology, the daughters of giants aren't necessarily themselves giants. In fact, while giants may be huge, hideous, multi-headed creatures, they often have beautiful daughters for some reason. I'm not entirely sure why it is, but it's a fairly common trope. For example, there's a myth in which the god Freyr, the fertility deity, falls in love with a giant's daughter named Gerdur, and sends his servant off to fetch her and convince her, mostly through threats, to come back to Valhalla and marry him, to come back to Asgard and marry him. Okay, so Volsung and Hjöd then have 11 children, right? Their eldest are twins, Sigmund and his sister Signy, and then there are 9 other sons who are so relatively unimportant that they simply get eaten by a wolf, right? Said wolf may very well be a sorceress in disguise. So we have like one more example of shape changing in the epic, right?
The story even said that she-wolf, the old she-wolf could have been their mother.
Yeah, Siggeir, King Siggeir's mother, right? Siggeir, the king of Gotaland in Sweden. Now, do we remember Gotaland? Who do we remember as king of Gotaland?
Siggeir, and then
From another text we've read. In southwestern Sweden. Beowulf. Yes. Siggeir occupies the same social position among the same people that Beowulf did. Though there's no indication that the Sigmund story is actually mentioned in Beowulf, so never mind. So yeah, Signy marries King Siggeir, and they have a number of apparently weakling sons, right?
Yeah.
Which leads Signy to, through magic, conceive a child with her own twin brother, Sinfiotli.
Wait, how do you say that?
Something like Sinfiotli, it's, I'm not entirely certain how you're really supposed to pronounce it. So I pronounce it like it's modern German. I don't really know enough about Old Norse pronunciation to be able to accurately tell you how that should be said. Provided we recognize the character, right? Sigmund and Sinfiotli avenge themselves upon King Siggeir. And what has Siggeir's crime been?
For killing Sigmund and Signy's father.
Yeah, he betrayed and killed both King Volsung and their 9 brothers, right?
Well, I mean, really, he didn't kill the 9 sons. Signy said just tie them to the stocks and leave them be. And he said that's a worse fate than what I had planned, but I guess it's better to let them die slowly than quickly.
Yeah. She convinces him, but he was just going to kill him, right? But she convinces him not to and to put them out in the woods, right? I guess, given the odds that one of them will thus then survive, which of course happens, yes. So Sigmund and Sinfiotli burn King Siggeir in his hall. And who burns with him?
Signy.
Yeah, she chooses to burn with her husband, right? Does that seem weird to you guys?
yes.
Yeah. 'Cause,
Okay.
She says I was miserable. She did not willingly go into her marriage, but she willingly died with him.
Yeah.
She developed into something different along the whole way.
Yeah. A lot of Signy's behavior seems strange and inexplicable, right? What else about Signy's behavior
She kills her sons.
or at the very least allows for them to be killed, right?
She sends them to their uncle and says, "Here, see if they're worth it." And one will need flour.
Yeah.
Which in the end we learned there was a poisonous snake in there, so he kills
Yep.
him. One will do. She kills them.
Yeah, they fail the tests, right? And we can see there that common fairy tale motif, right? That the older brothers always fail the task, right? And it's always the youngest, the least likely, who manages to succeed, right? Although in this case, in order to get that successful offspring, she has had to mate with her own brother. So you've got a figure here in Sinfiotli who is 100% Volsung, right?
That's continuously brought up with the Volsung descendants is
Uh-huh.
view of that Volsung stock.
Yeah. So yeah, there's clearly like a sense that Volsung stock is somehow superior to other lesser lineages, right? That, no child Siggeir fathers on Signy is going to be tough enough to take him on, right? You've got to have a kid who is all Volsung in order to achieve that vengeance. And that's, I think, like, the big driving factor here in Signy's behavior, right, is that cultural imperative towards vengeance. That it is her duty as daughter and sister to avenge her slaughtered kin, no matter how she feels about her husband or her children. Right? That duty to avenge the dead relations supersedes everything else. So there is actually a cultural logic that informs her actions here, right? Even if much of what she does seems inexplicable or capricious to us.
But at the same time, Siggeir isn't in as much trouble. He broke guest rules.
Yeah, Siggeir breaks the laws of hospitality. In fact, he specifically invites the Volsungs
Come on, it's 3 months' time.
to his hall to kill, and refuses their hospitality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because he's pissed off about the sword that Sigmund won't sell to him. So, there's this notion of like sort of putting personal possessions over these, familial relationships, or your obligations, both as guest and host, right? He violates both sets of those obligations. So Signy and Siggeir and all their offspring disappear, right, from the earth. So this line is finished, is out of the saga within about the first dozen pages or so, right? Sigmund and Sinfjotli have some adventures together. They spend some time as wolves. And I think it's worth noting as well that a wolf, or the word for wolf, was often a kind of colloquialism in Old Norse for an outlaw. So while the saga does have them literally transform into wolves, figuratively, it's related to their status as outlaws. And then what ultimately happens to Sinfjotli? What's his personality like?
He's not arrogant.
Yeah, he's boastful, right? He's arrogant. He has no problem insulting people, right?
Yep.
I mean, Sigmund even, he makes him knead the bread, and he's like, yeah, I'll do it, fine.
Uh-huh.
He's like, but I did notice there was something suspicious about it. He's like, yeah, there's a poisonous snake in
Uh-huh.
it. He said, oh, well.
Yeah, okay,
He's like,
I just
"Don't
crushed
eat
it, yeah.
He's like, you don't eat it, you can't handle it. He's like, I can handle it.
Uh-huh.
He's like, no, you can't. Like your dad uncle is telling you you can't handle it. You can only take poison externally.
Yeah. Although, like, he is, as a Volsung, unusually tough. Yeah, he's still not as tough as, we learn later on how it is that Sigmund manages to resist poison, right? He says you filter the drink through your mustache, right? that will that'll get you out of this. But Sinfjotli fails to do so, right? And dies. He's poisoned by King Sigmund's wife, this Borghild. So Sigmund marries this Borghild, and has two sons by her, right? Was a Helgi and Hammond, I think.
And one of them just exists.
Yeah, we know nothing about Hammond, and Helgi is out of the saga after a few victories, right? Sigmund then marries again a woman named Hjordis, and before he dies, manages to father on her Sigurd. Now, because his father is dead before he's born, what does this indicate about Sigurd's family relationships? Who does he always have to rely on? First his mother, right? And then a series of foster fathers, right? And then later on, in-laws. So his mother marries this guy, King Alf of Denmark. And Sigurd himself is fostered by a blacksmith named Regan, who was himself one of the sons of a shape-shifting sorcerer named Hreidmar. The other two being Otur and Fafnir. Right. Regan doesn't show any signs of being able to change his shape, though he is an excellent craftsman. And liar. Well, yeah, Otur and Fafnir are both shapeshifters. And this is another place where gods come into the saga, right? That the gods accidentally kill Otur, not realizing that he is actually a man in otter form and not really an otter. And then they have to pay weregild to his relations, right? And so Fafnir's treasure, the treasure that Fafnir kills his father and turns into a dragon to protect, is weregild for his brother Otur, and includes a cursed ring called a Varanot.
Isn't the weregild Otur's body? Or they take his skin and stuff it?
Yeah, essentially what Hreidmar demands is that every inch of his son's skin be covered with gold, right? And that's what, like, the ring was the last thing that the dwarf Andvari held back of his treasure. And it's at the point when Loki comes back and takes the ring that Andvari puts the curse. Okay, like, he takes this to cover the last hair on Otter's tail. And it's at that point that Andvari curses the treasure and says that, you know, whoever possesses it will get their death from it, right? So Sigurd is convinced to go and battle Fafnir by his foster father Regan, kills Fafnir. As he roasts the dragon's heart for Regan to eat, he tastes the juices and can understand the speech of birds and learns that Regan is planning to kill him. And so does Regan in first. And then there's an interesting thing that happens here. Like it seems like there are two different versions here, right, of his wooing of the Valkyrie Brynhild. That the text seems to be trying to resolve together, but it doesn't quite work. It looks almost like he meets and wins Brynhild 2 separate times, right?
Yeah.
Do you know why that would be?
Mistranslation?
It's not a mistranslation so much. In order to explain this, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about biblical criticism. Because the method that the primary method scholars now use to understand the way the Bible is constructed, at least the Old Testament in particular, is very similar to what's probably happened here, right? So you may be aware that you took World Lit 1 with me ages ago, right?
2017.
Okay, yeah. So you may remember then when we talked about, like, if we looked at some passages from Genesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the Noah's Ark story, there are 2 separate descriptions of Noah taking animals onto the ark, right? There's one where he just takes 2 of every kind of animal, right? And then there's another that follows it almost immediately that says that he took a certain number of pairs of clean animals and a certain number of pairs of unclean animals, right? So these 2 stories seem to contradict each other, right? What they actually reflect is different sources being woven together. The earlier source, where it's just 2 of every animal, from an early stage in the Israelite religion where it's still just another Mediterranean fertility cult. And the second description, where you've got this division between clean and unclean animals, from a more developed stage, where you've got like an organized state religion that has dietary rules and things like that, right? There's a similar thing that goes on with a lot of these sagas, right? So this particular saga and many of the Fornaldarsogur are drawn from a body of material known as Eddic poems. And the Eddic poems originate probably in oral tradition. Many of them present variant versions of familiar myths, and they are primarily concerned with the doings of gods and heroes and dwarves. There's one, I can't remember the name of the poem off the top of my head, but one of the things that is contained in that particular poem is a list of the names of all of the dwarves. And the names of the dwarves are things like Balin, Dvalin, Fili, things so like Tolkien takes the names of the dwarves from The Hobbit directly from one of these old Eddic poems.
So, with these 2 different tellings of Brynhild, the first telling would probably be more along the lines of what actually happened, and the second telling would be more like the Christianized version.
Well, one thing to remember with the sagas is that by the time these are composed, Iceland is already Christianized. The Vikings convert sometime, I think, in the 11th century. So Iceland is a Christian country at this point.
Well, say that in like the first half we have the strong shield maiden who will not marry. She wants to go to war and fight for the kings. But in the second half we have, like, when I say Christianized, I mean like, we have this beautiful maiden who is sitting and embroidering.
Okay, yeah, it's a much more kind of domesticated picture, right?
Yeah.
It's a little closer to what we get. There's a poem in Middle High German called the Nibelungenlied, or the Song of the Nibelungs, which is similar in most regards to the Saga of the Volsungs. The characters are more or less the same, though they have slightly different names. And yeah, the plot outline is basically the same. And this poem is composed in what is now Austria, around the year 1200. Now, if you look at the two side by side, you would think that the Nibelungenlied is the later poem, or is the later text, because it has all the features of medieval chivalric romance, right? So it takes the same basic story material, or the same basic core of the story, and translates it to a specifically medieval romance context, right? Instead of leaving it in the realm of Germanic myth, as the Volsungs Saga largely does. However, the Saga of the Volsungs is composed sometime between 1200 and 1270. So the two poems are roughly contemporary. In fact, the two texts are roughly contemporary. In fact, the Saga of the Volsungs might even be later. So what we're seeing here are really more kind of different approaches rather than different stages of civilizational development, right? And I think that might be more the case with the two Brynhild stories here too, right? That it's not so much that they're drawn from sources that are composed at different times, but they do show significantly different versions of this particular character, right? Now keep the Brynhild stuff in mind, again, when we get to Tolkien, because Brynhild is, just as Gandalf is a source of inspiration just as Odin is a source of inspiration for Gandalf, Brynhild is a source of inspiration for Eowyn. In particular, the whole kind of like wild shield maiden versus domesticated wife kind of thing, right? Does Brynhild end up being successfully domesticated by anyone? Not so much, right? We have this family that Sigurd marries into. Right? He marries a princess named Gudrun. And Gudrun has three brothers. Gunnar, Hogni, and Guttorm. And this is a situation where, once again, it's important to remember that Sigurd really has no family of his own to rely on, right? So he always has to rely on these family connections that are a little bit more distant and thus less reliable, right? Remember, the Sigmund-Signy relationship here is all based on, the connection, between this father's lineage, right? So they are reliant on each other. Sigurd doesn't have any of that, as the last of the Volsungs, at least that he's aware of, right? Because Helgi is out of the saga. And who knows about Hamund? And what are Gunnar, Hogni, and Guttorm like? What is it that causes contention between Sigurd and Gunnar?
I'm looking for it, I promise. I know that Gudrun and her brothers, they are the best of the best. They have to be the
yeah.
best.
Yeah, or at least, yeah, they're all beautiful and skilled, right?
Yeah.
And Gunnar wants to marry Brynhild, who has already promised herself to Sigurd, right? But to make all this even more complicated, right, Sigurd has completely forgotten his promise to Brynhild because of the forgetfulness potion that Gudrun's mother has given him, so he'll marry her daughter, right?
Yeah.
So he woos Brynhild in Gunnar's shape. Puts his sword between them, so as not to violate the blood brother oath, right? And then brings her back out of the fire. And it's this cursed ring that's been exchanged between them that is the factor of recognition here, right? So we're again seeing a lot of elements here that come back in Tolkien that Tolkien is going to take and pick up and rework, right? We've got the cursed ring. We've got the disinherited family line. We've got the shield maiden. We've got the dragon guarding the treasure. I want to talk a little bit more about Fafnir momentarily. And we've also got the sword reforged motif, right? Right, this sword, Brom, that Sigmund pulls out of the tree and that is broken at his death, right? And that Regan reforges for Sigurd before he goes to take on Fafnir. Now, one other thing that I want to just discuss briefly before we move on to the Fafnir episode, now that we've sort of teased out what all the relationships are between these various characters, right? Did you notice anything weird about when characters are told their future?
Page 60. Gripper foretells Sigurd's future. There was a man named Gripper, the brother of Sigurd's mother. Soon after the sword had been made, Sigurd went to meet with Gripper. Because this uncle could see into the future and knew the fate of men, Sigurd asked Gripper how his life would go. For a long time, Gripper was unwilling to answer. But finally, yielding to Sigurd's fervent pleas, he told him his whole fate, exactly as it later came to pass. When Gripper had told him these things, as he and Regan said, "Kill Fafnir as you promised," Sigurd answered, "I shall not do that, but first, I shall do that, but first I must do something else, avenge King Sigmund and my other relatives who fell for that."
Okay, so if Gripir foretells Sigurd's whole future, right? Presumably Sigurd now knows all of these other things that are going to happen to him, right? He knows that Regan intends to betray him. He knows that he'll be given the drink of forgetfulness to forget Brynhild and marry Gudrun instead, right? And he knows that Guttorm will sneak into his bedroom in the morning and try to kill him. Does this affect the course of the narrative in any way?
He still goes about his business.
Yeah. In fact, this would suggest that he doesn't even need to taste the blood from the dragon's heart to know that Regan is going to try to kill him, right?
Well, he's also warned again when he's on the road. Odin warns him.
Yeah. And then later on, Brynhild predicts both of their futures, right? And neither of them behaves any differently as a result. So, again, what kind of attitude does this suggest towards prophecy and towards the future?
If it's going to happen, it's going to happen. There's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah.
Except being weird.
Yeah, it's that whole weird concept again, right? You know, and the thing that's funny about this too, like it's almost comical the way that Sigurd in this episode with Gripir begs his uncle to tell him the future. And then when he does tell him, he's like, what are you going to do? And goes home, right? And does exactly what he was going to do anyway. So yeah, this kind of all-encompassing capitulation to fate, like this deep, deep fatalism, is also central to this particular text. And I think that we may want to keep this in mind as well when we read The Lord of the Rings, and there are things that happen that seem kind of like weirdly providential. I think he's drawing as much on Christian ideas of providence and on old Germanic ideas of weird at various moments in The Lord of the Rings. So let's go to the fight with Fafnir, which is described in a section called Regan and Sigurd Go Riding, right? No mention of Fafnir in the title. What was weird, if anything, about the fight with Fafnir?
He had to defeat him, he had to dig a ditch.
Yeah.
Well, Regan tells him, dig a ditch, and when he's, slinks by, stab him. And then Odin comes through, or someone comes through and says, dig several ditches to avoid the dragon's blood.
Yeah. Yeah, what would happen if he just digs the single ditch like Regan tells him to?
He'd burn or drown.
Yeah. He'd drown in the dragon's blood, right? Which, of course, is what Regan wants. This is a totally passive way for Regan to get everything he wants, right? Fafnir's dead. I get the treasure. Sigurd is also dead, right?
But even as Fafnir is dying, he asks, who urged you on to this deed, and why did you let yourself be persuaded? Have you not heard that all people are afraid of me and my helm of terror? He's like, dude, who convinced you to do this?
Yeah.
Are you that stupid, or like what?
Yeah, yeah, boy with the sharp eyes, you had a keen father. Yeah. So let's go through this conversation actually, because it is a kind of interesting and cryptic little episode here. Go back to page 63. Right. So first, when the worm crawled to the water and the earth quaked mightily, so that all the ground nearby shook, he blew poison over all the path before him. But Sigurd was neither afraid of nor concerned by the din. And when the serpent crawled over the pit, Sigurd plunged the sword up under the left shoulder so that it sank to the hilt. Then Sigurd leapt up out of the ditch and drew the sword out of the serpent. His arms were all bloody to the shoulder. And when the huge worm felt his mortal wound, he thrashed his head and his tail, destroying everything that got in his way. So, what is established here about dragons?
They're like worms, they don't have...
What is established here about the weak spots of dragons?
The underbelly?
Yeah, the weak underbelly, right? Yeah. We're going to see this with Smaug again in The Hobbit. And when Fafnir received his death wound, he asked, who are you, or who is your father, or who is your family, you who are so impudent that you dare to bear weapons against me? Sigurd replied, my family is unknown to men. I am called the noble beast. I have neither father nor mother, and I have traveled alone. Fafnir answered, if you have neither father nor mother, from what wonder were you born? And although you will not tell me your name on my dying day, you know that you were lying. He answered, my name is Sigurd and my father is Sigmund. Fafnir then asked, Who urged you on to this deed? This is the other part you quoted, right?
Mhm.
Sigurd said, a hard mind wedded me for this deed, and I was supported in it by the strong hand and the sharp sword, which you are now familiar with. Few are bold in old age who are cowardly in childhood. Fafnir said, I know that if you had grown up with your kinsmen, you would know how to fight when angered. But it is yet stranger that a prisoner taken in war should have dared to fight me, because few captives are valiant in a fight. Sigurd spoke, You revile me for being removed from my kinsmen. Even though I was taken in war, I was not bound, and you have discovered that I was free. Fafnir answered, You take everything I say as spoken with malice, but this gold that was mine will be your death. Sigurd replied, Everyone wants to have wealth until that one day, but everyone must die sometime. Fafnir said, You do not want to heed my advice, but you will drown if you voyage unwarily by sea. Remain instead on land until it is calm. Sigurd said, Tell me, Fafnir, if you are so wise, who are the Norns who separate sons from their mothers? Fafnir replied, They are many and sundry. Some are of the race of Aesir, some are of the race of elves, and some are of the daughters of Dvalin. Sigurd said, What is the name of that island where Surt and the Aesir will mix together their blood? Fafnir answered, It is called Oskak, the Uncreated. Now, what do you notice about the basic pattern of their conversation here?
Sigurd's got all the questions.
Yeah, at first Fafnir is questioning, right? And then Sigurd is questioning, right? So most of their conversation consists of cryptic questions and answers. This seems kind of odd. For, a dying dragon, right? To be riddling with his killer, and then with the killer to be riddling in turn with the dying dragon, right? Nonetheless, this is how their conversation proceeds. And this, again, I would say, I don't, want to just treat this all as a source spotting exercise. But yeah, again, keep this in mind, remember this, when we see Bilbo's encounter with Smaug, and also when we read the Children of Húrin, the conversations between Turin Turambar and the dragon Glaurung. So we'll see Tolkien do kind of two separate reworkings of the Fafnir-Sigurd conversation. One of them in heroic mode, and the other in a more ironic mock-heroic mode. What did you guys make of Sigurd's death scene here?
What page is that?
Look on page 90. Is there something weirdly anticlimactic about this?
Yeah, Gudrun stabs him through the bed, and
Yeah, after chickening out, right?
after
chickening out twice.
Sigurd wakes up, takes the sword, throws it, splits him in two,
Uh-huh.
and when Gudrun wakes up, He's like, calm down, gives this big old speech, and then
Yeah.
just dies.
Yeah.
And it says, it would have been more difficult for them to kill me than the fiercest wild bison or boar. The king now died.
Yeah. And, I mean, like, does this read like a hero's dramatic death?
No.
That he's killed in his bed by the weakest of his wife's 3 brothers, right? Like, weakest of body and of brain. Who can't bring himself to go in and stab a sleeping man twice,
Yeah.
then goes in and does it the 3rd time, and is himself cut in half for his efforts, right? So, yeah, the whole, like, Sigurd's whole story ends, like, almost weirdly comically, right? Right? He's stabbed in the bed. His wife wakes up screaming, drenched in blood. He gives a little speech, and then he dies. And Brynhild insists on being burned with him, right? You look on page 92. Brynhild continued, "Now, Gunnar, I ask a final request of you. Let one huge funeral pyre be raised on the level field for all of us, for me and Sigurd and for those who were killed with them. Let there be tents reddened with the blood of men. Burn the Hunnish king there at my side," Sigurd, that is, "and at his other side my men, 2 at his head, 2 at his feet, and 2 hawks. Thus it will be equally divided. Lay there between us a drawn sword as before, when we entered one bed and vowed to become man and wife. The door will not close on his heels if I follow him, and our funerary procession will not be unworthy if following him are 5 bondwomen and 8 attendants given me by my father. And those who were killed with Sigurd will also burn there. I would speak further if I were not wounded, but now the gash hisses and the wound is opening. But I have told the truth." Sigurd's body was then prepared according to the ancient custom, and a tall pyre was built. When it was fully kindled, the body of Sigurd, the bane of Fafnir, was laid on top of it, along with his 3-year-old son, whom Brynhild had ordered killed, and the body of Guttorm. When the pyre was all ablaze, Brynhild went out upon it and told her chambermaids to take the gold that she wanted them to have. Then Brynhild died, and her body burned there with Sigurd. Thus their lives ended. So Brynhild ends much as Signy did, right?
Yeah.
With a man whom she both loved and hated, upon whom she has avenged herself.
Question.
Yeah,
Gudrun just let her kid be killed?
that kind of thing seems to happen, yeah.
I know, but it's like you
Mhm.
let the other woman kill your son instead of protecting him and carrying on that line.
Yeah, well, and Gudrun will, for the remainder of the saga, enact an extremely complicated revenge against her brothers. So what's important here is again, like, it's a kind of continuation of these cycles of violence and vengeance and feuding, right? The sagas, this one in particular, really aren't too soft-hearted about children.
No.
I think one of the things that we often forget when we look at texts from past eras is that people were kind of generally a little bit less soft-hearted about children. Childhood was not necessarily regarded as a separate category of development. Kids were little adults. As soon as they could, they were expected to do the same kind of work adults could. On top of that, pre-antibiotics, children died of disease all the time, right? You get a cut, it gets infected. You could die from that, right? So people were often behaved in ways that suggest less attachment to their children. People were also much more closely attached to death in their everyday lives than we are. Not only because people died around them more frequently, but even like, your general means of getting food, right? I mean, like, if we want a steak, do we have to go out into the yard and kill a cow? No, yeah, we just, we go to the Food Lion, and there it is, shrink wrapped in the cold storage section, right? With no indication, really, of the animal that it used to be, right? It's just the steaks wrapped up in plastic. So, for our ancestors, this was not the case, right? Death and violence were around them more or less all the time. And so there is often a little bit, like, what seems to us a little bit less sentimentality, particularly around animals and children, or concerning animals and children. We will also often, a kind of related note, often find much more frank and earthy attitudes to sex than we expect. In part because people rarely had private rooms, unless you were very wealthy. So, if you and if the husband or wife want to get intimate, you just, maybe you wait till the kids are asleep, right? But they're right over there because you live in a one-room hut and there's no place for you to go, right? So, so in general, like, body functions are a lot less private in ancient medieval texts. People don't have any real expectation of privacy. And, Gutorm can just walk in to Sigurd's bedroom in the morning and stab him while he's asleep.
Yep, and the sister right there.
Yep. I mean, I believe the text tells us that Gutorm is also both drunk and expelled. So, his will is perhaps not entirely his own. But okay, so I think we've hit on most of the elements here that Tolkien is using to construct his narratives in The Lord of the Rings and in some of the earlier texts that precede The Lord of the Rings. Do you guys have any questions about any of this stuff? Because I'm kind of said my piece here. We're good? All right, great. Then remember Sir Orfeo for next time, and we'll see you on Wednesday.